And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing the next system here starting to move in toward the western Aleutians here with increasing wind and snow in that area later tonight. This system moves up to the North Gulf, just south of Prince William Sound. So snow along the North Gulf Coast here, rain and snow down across the Panhandle. And then tomorrow that system actually weakens here in the Gulf of Alaska, and the front weakens into a trough as a new low center here saps some of the energy of this system and spreads more rain into the southern southeast coast. Meanwhile, the big winds are out here over the Aleutians, full gales coming in with this system, and then for the next day that tracks eastward here and pushes northward, bringing gale force winds into Bristol Bay, especially the Alaska Peninsula here down toward the eastern Aleutians with areas of snow and blowing snow. Increasing wind and precipitation here across southern Alaska, especially the North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island. Snow changing to rain, gusty east winds with rain, possibly moderate to heavy at times. For the coastal water forecast, south winds 15 to 25 knots there for the south coast, and small craft advisories on the central coast for south winds 30 knots, east to south winds 25 to 30 knots on the north coast. Clarence Strait. Lightest winds for the inside waters out of the southeast at 10 knots for the day Thursday, 25 knot southeast winds for Stevens Passage, and 30 to 35 knot southeast winds there for Lynn Canal. And for Friday, Lynn Canal winds down to 15 knots out of the southeast, 10 knot southeasterlies for Stevens Passage, and west at 15 for Clarence Strait. South coast, on Friday, west winds 20 knots, central coast west at 15, and the north coast variable 10 to 15 knots. Prince William Sound for Thursday, northwest winds 25 knots, northwest at 20 for the eastern North Gulf Coast, western North Gulf Coast here north at 25, northwesterlies 25 to 30 knots for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, and variable to north winds 10 to 15 knots for Cook Inlet. These winds increase dramatically to gale force here south of the Forelands on Friday out of the northeast, looking at gale force northeast winds there for southern Cook Inlet, 35 knots, northeast 40 knots for Kamishak Bay, southeast at 40 for the Barren Islands, and northeast at 30 knots for the western North Gulf Coast. Otherwise, Prince William Sound and the eastern North Gulf Coast looking at east winds at 15 knots. Kodiak Island, west winds 20 knots for Thursday. Same forecast for Bristol Bay with 8-foot seas there. Northwest, 20 to 25 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And then for Friday, gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, northeast to northwest winds, 40 to 45 knots. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay, north winds 35 knots, seas 8 feet, and east to southeast winds at 40 knots for Kodiak Island. And for Unalaska Island tomorrow, west winds 30 to 35 knots, Nikolsky over to Adak and Atka, east to southeast winds at 45 knots. And then for Adak over to Amchitka, east to northeast winds 45 knots, and Kiska to Shemya, north winds 30 to 40 knots. For Friday, from Shemya to Kiska, west winds 30 knots, Adak and Atka Island here looking at north winds 40 knots and north winds 45 knots for all of the eastern Aleutians with seas running 17 to 23 feet. And for the southwest coast for Thursday, looking at northwest winds here 15 to 20 knots, northwest 15 for St. Lawrence Island, variable at 15 for the Pribilos, and northeast at 15 for St. Matthew Island. Then on Friday, north 25 there for St. Paul and St. George, and north of 20 St. Matthew Island, Kuskokwim Delta Coast, south of Nunivak Island, which is the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, north winds 30 knots, Yukon Delta Coast, St. Lawrence Island, and Norton Sound, north winds 10 to 15. Light variable winds here for the western central Arctic coast tomorrow at 5 knots, otherwise 10 to 15 knot northwest winds for the Chukchi Sea, and west-southwest at 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Then on Friday here, west to southwest, 5 to 10 knots there for the central and eastern Arctic coast. West side, south at 5. Really light winds here, variable 5 to 15, about covers it there for the Chukchi Sea.